Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, part 2 of our Getting Started with DevExtreme React Grid presented by DevExpress Web Program Manager, Mehul Harry. In this session, you'll learn about the DevExtreme React Grid's composable plugin-based architecture, material UI theming, stateless and stateful mode, remote data binding, Redux support, and the future roadmap. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning. Welcome everyone to Getting Started with the DevExtreme React Grid Part 2. And in this webinar, we're going to just start off exactly where we left off. And in Part 1, if you remember, we started with how to get started sort of with a file new experience, using the Create React App project. And that gives us a way to quickly add a basic project and then start adding things as we did, like Bootstrap. And then we brought in the DevExtreme React Grid. And then we looked at navigation and routing. Now, as we saw in each of these instances, the way React is structured, it allowed us to bring these in as packages and then simply use the components within them to leverage their functionality. Now, if you haven't seen part 1, of course, I highly recommend you do, because not only do we talk about just the basics of React and how to get started, but more importantly, as is the goal of this webinar, is to teach you about the React Grid and specifically how it is designed. And because it is designed with React in mind and it was written specifically for React, things like adding new features involves generally adding components and setting it up differently. Now, we also used Bootstrap for part 1. And as I mentioned in part 1, in this webinar, I'll focus more on Material UI because we support both Bootstrap and Material UI. Now, in this webinar, in part 2, we have to dive deeper into React because React is beautiful. I mean, when React first came out, people were really excited. They said, listen, it's got a simplicity to it because you're focused only on the view, and it's got this concept of a virtual DOM, and this idea with the JSX where you're writing JavaScript, it's JavaScript centric and not HTML5 centric. So it's really unique features allowed it to really grasp to some developers' mindsets. And so another thing also was its concept with state and unidirectional data flow. So we're going to talk about state today, and it's an important topic that I had to say for part 2. As you'll see, it's most of what we're doing today is talking about state, but then we'll also dive into custom templates and how to extend the grid's functionality in UI. And of course, I'll be dealing mostly with the Material UI, and I'll show you how easy it is to add Material UI. And then most of 1, 2, 3 involves us coding something. Actually, most of everything today is dealing with code, but more than anything, I don't want you to focus in on the code. It's understanding the concepts, grasping and understanding, for example, how does the concept of unidirectional data flow work with React, and how does remote data binding fit into it? What is Redux? And so after we deal with all of this, we're then going to talk real quick about the roadmap and if you have any questions. Okay, so with that, let's get started. Now, as I did in part 1, I'm going to basically start off in Visual Studio Code. And I've got the same project. As we'll see in a minute, we are leaving off exactly where we left off, where we stopped in the last webinar. So let's just do npm start. And again, even in the last webinar, I think it's more important that you not try to do every command that I did. Rather, the concept is to understand, for example, if I want to use a component in React, of course, I have to bring in the npm package, which adds it to our package.json. But then how do we declare using the import statement? And then when does it matter that we separate out the component in its own concept and its own component? And then, of course, how do we do things like features, bring in the components? So we covered all that in part one. And as we saw, we had a Bootstrap nav bar that allowed us to have a grid in one view, and of course, the home page that just said hello world. Now, as you can imagine, in a web view, just about any web view, we have this concept of state. And what that means is that every component needs to keep track of something. So in our case, for example, this grid needs to keep track that we are currently on page 2, or that we've sorted by country. And so that state is stored within the grid. Every component in React is capable of storing it. It's stateful. And so this is a very useful concept. However, sometimes you will have to understand that we may not want the component to keep state, but we may want to allow that state to be stored at the parent level. So at this point, this is in the grid component, but it's useful sometimes to take control of that state, because then we can affect things within the grid from an external standpoint, as we'll see in a minute. So let's talk about state in general in React. And I think that's a good place to start. Now, as I mentioned, this site from Facebook actually has some great articles in it. Now, let's start with the first concept of what they call components and props. And so, as you know, React lets you split your UI into independent components, and that's really nice. They work in isolation. And there's two ways React recommends that you work with state. There's the object called state, and then there's this concept of props. Now, props are essentially a way for you to pass data from parent to child. And what that means is that if we had, let's say, a component called welcome, and that component's only job was to show a hello world or something like that, well, we may want to have a variable where we set what the name is. And so props allows us to do that. And so in our component, props is where we're going to be able to pass in some arbitrary input. And so this, as you can imagine, comes in quite handy when you have a form or something like that where you need to send a bunch of data. And so here, what we're doing is says, listen, I understand that welcome is going to be displaying it, and I want you to take what I send in. And so then, for example, at the parent level, we can then call the component, and then we can pass it in. We can pass in the item. So for example, here we're calling the welcome component and setting a props called name with a value of Sarah, so that when it gets rendered, it is then defined. Now, there is a concept also of state. Now, state is a little bit different. State is also something we're going to use for UI components. However, state allows us to do to actually store information that the component may need later. So in this case, we are simply passing the data into the component. However, what if we want to let the component store some information between perhaps DOM updates and so forth? Well, that's where state's kind of come in handy. And so one of the key differences between props and state is that if you want to keep state, there are two types of components, as we know in React. We have these pure function components. That means they're stateless. And if you want to use state and lifecycle events, you need to use what's called an ES6 class. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second. So that is a very high level overview. And again, the goal of this webinar is to not essentially go through everything. Again, it could take hours to dive into each one of these topics. So I recommend, if you're really interested, definitely look into them. However, I simply want to give you sort of the highlights. Now, as I mentioned, another concept to understand about state is that unidirectional data flow. Now, the first thing to understand also is that props are read-only. When we pass in some information from parent to child, we are not meant to affect that data that gets passed in. And that's another reason to understand that we don't, for something like that, that's when you would use state. So props are only meant as data that we're passing in. And so therefore, they say all React components must act like pure functions That means there's no, they're stateless, they don't change when it comes to props. So do not mess prop. Props are basically used to pass data in. All right, that said, we also have a concept of state. And for that, React actually gives us an object. Now, the only thing I think you should understand about state, for now, is that state allows us to store something like, let's say, for example, in this example, they have a component called tick. And what tick does, I'm sorry, here we have a method called tick, but what it does, it's displaying a clock on the screen. And to do that, it's using the local date and time and then incrementing it. And so initially, we're simply just doing that, but within the function. However, eventually they say, well, listen, that is something that can be stored in state. And therefore, they convert it to, of course, to a class and then store it into the state object. And then a couple of things they mentioned is that, listen, anytime you're working with state, generally on the constructor, you're going to set state. But after that, you always want to use the set state method. Okay, so we'll see all of this in just a second. But what's important to understand is that when you're working with state, it's unidirectional, meaning that state is immutable. Every time you call the set state method, you're not replacing state, you're actually creating a new object tree. And why this is important is this is one of the benefits in React that says, listen, when I call the set state method with a new value, I want you to copy the previous one and replace, for example, the comment value with hello. And so what's nice about this is this keeps track of that unidirectional data flow, but it also gives us some real nice benefits, meaning that we always know what web components updated the state. And it gives us a way to really, it makes debugging easier. It just makes a lot of things really nice with React. Okay, so with that, how does state work with our controls? Well, as I mentioned, generally, the grid is in what we call a stateful mode. And we call it uncontrolled because the developer, are not controlling it. However, you may have occasion to say, listen, I need more control over sorting or paging, etc. Anything in the grid you want to take control of, we've made that possible with our architecture, with our extensible plugin architecture. So as you've seen before, when we want to change, when we wanted to add sorting, we brought in the sorting state plugin. When we want to plug paging, we brought in the paging plugins, etc. However, in the there's a few modes. So initially, we're in a stateful mode. Now you might not even need to go to the controlled stateless mode right away. You might just say, listen, all I really want to do is have a mode where I'm just setting some values, and that's actually really easy, and that's what we call setting the initial state. So for example, in paging, we set the initial default page size. So for example, in the paging state plugin, I defined a prop called, it has a prop called default page size, and I specified a value for it. Now, in the same way, we can go further, and let's say, for example, here, let's keep our app open here, and I want to set the default current page. Now it is 0 index space, so if I set it to 1, we'll start off on initially on page 2. So here, as we see, now the grid is always going to start, whether I refresh or not, on page 2. And so as you see, you don't have to. For example, I still have a pure function here, and the grid is keeping the state. So this grid component is keeping the state. However, I have some control over it. Even though it's a stateful component, I'm letting it do things like setting the default page size and the value. And I can go further, and I can say, listen, I also want to set the initial value for sorting. And for that, we've got the default sorting set to company name, and the direction is ascending. And I can just as easy say, listen, I want to set it for country. And as you can see, our grid, of course, will hot reload, and we're now on country. And let me make one remark here that it's important to understand that, I mentioned in the last webinar that sorting is important. So for example, I think when I left off, I had sorting over here. When you do that, this is going to have slightly different results. So for example, in this case, we are paging comes first and sorting comes second. So when I sort here, as you can see, I am sorting by the values that are displayed here. I'm not sorting by the entire grid. However, in this case, that may not make sense when I'm sorting by country. So instead, if I put the sorting widget first, as you can see, whatever page I'm on, I'm going to sort the entire grid first and then display the results, which seems more accurate in this scenario. So again, we talk about this in our documentation. Now, let's say though we want to go further, and this is where you're going to find the grid's one of the most important capabilities, which is to delegate its state management outside of itself. Usually it's to the parent component, and it can be a piece or the whole state. However, it doesn't have to be. Now, in this case, let's say we want to completely take over the sorting of the widget of the web grid component. What we're going to do is we're going to come over and not only take over control of how it's sorted, but when it is sorted. And so as you can imagine, when I click on this, there's an event that fires off. And for the grid's instance, of course, as you imagine, it's called onSorting change. Now, in the state and lifecycle management topic, as I mentioned, they tell you, listen, if you've got a pure functional component, if you got a functional component called clock, then you need to convert it, of course, to a ES6 class that extends the React component, which also means you need to have a render method. And then you also have to, generally, when you got a pure functional component, you don't need to refer to yourself as this. But when you got an ES6 class, you need to refer to yourself as this and your properties inside. And then we get access to not only the state object tree, but we also get access to lifecycle events. For example, we get access to lifecycle events like component did mount and will unmount. And these allow you, for example, to hook into when the component has been rendered to the DOM, which can be really useful. So in this example here, they use it to update the timer. In our case, we're going to use it for other items, as we'll see a little bit later. Okay, so how do we convert it over? Now, it's actually quite easy to convert. So as we see, from a pure functional component, we've got this topic, but as we can see, to set it up as a EX6 class is actually quite easy. So as much as possible, I'm only going to try to paste code. Now, when copying and pasting code, of course, we want to be careful. But essentially, we have to declare a class, and as they say, we have to extend the React component. Now, this is always going to have, it needs to have the render method. And the render method has also a return. So again, this allows us to say, now the grid view is going to be returning this. And then, of course, make sure we got the right amount of parentheses. And of course, as we do this, what we'll see is that at this point, you're not going to see any difference. All we've done is gone from a pure functional component over to an ES6 class. However, this now allows us the capability to add a constructor. And so at the constructor level, we can start defining state. So right before the render method, I can come in here and say, listen, in the constructor, I have to call something called super. Now, let's ignore that output for a second so I can explain to you a couple of things. Now, as they say, we need to call this super because what it does, it allows us to pass props to the base constructor. That's it. So in our case, if we have props that need to the base constructor, the super allows it to do that. However, this is where the magic gets started. Now, here, as we can see, we've got a we're referring to ourselves as this. That says, hey, this grid view component, I want to set the state because, hey, this is the constructor. There's nothing in the state at this point. So we're simply setting it. And I'm setting sorting, and I've got an array here of values that says, listen, I've got a prop called column name, and its values company name, and its direction is ascending. And so now I am setting the initial state. And I'm also telling it, listen, I know you have an event called onSorting change, and I want you to bind it to the onSorting change that I am going to define. And so now we can define that here right underneath. And as we'll see here, the onSorting change essentially takes a parameter called sorting. As we'll see, it's an array of values. And we call the this.setState method. So anytime sorting changes, we update the state using that setState method that lets the state stay immutable, but just creates a new object. And as you'll see, this comes in very handy. But we have now, using this approach, taken over sorting. Now, here we're setting the initial values for sorting. But now we don't need to because we are doing this over here in the constructor. And so all we need to tell the sorting plugin is, hey, listen, I want you to let the parent manage this. So the sorting is going to be handled by this grid view component and not this our DevExtreme Grid web component. So now we've taken over state from this component to the parent. And it says, listen, also for the onSorting change, you're going to be letting this handle it. So in this case now, we've taken over control of the state. And so at this point, as we can see, we're using company name as the initial value. So now if I set it to city, our grid will recompile. And as we can see, it allows us to manage state at this level. So now we've gone from a uncontrolled mode to a controlled mode, and we're making this grid stateless. Now, this says that the sorting now lives at the parent component level, the grid view component, and we have full control over the sorting state. We own it. Now we can also do things like block sorting changes. For example, we can block out the onSorting change method if we wanted to disable that. And this is useful, let's say, or we can look at it by column level and say, for this column, I don't want it to sort, or things like that. So we have full control over it, and we define exactly why that's useful. Now, let's implement one real-world scenario where using this controlled mode for the sorting state can be a benefit. So let's add a button that allows us to change the sorting. Now, before we do that, right now, if I sort by country and company name, and I'm holding down Shift here, and if I click again, I can do ascending here and descending here. But as soon as I refresh this, you can see I go back to my initial state. Let's first use the browser's SessionStorage to save this into our DOM. So we can do this very easily by coming in here and defining a method that calls the SessionStorage setItem method. And in it, I'm setting a parameter called grid sorting, and just taking the array that's in sorting and converting it to JSON and sorting it in SessionStorage. So now, for example, if I click this, and I've got multiple sorting, and if I take a look at our F12 browser session object, if we take a look at application SessionStorage, you can see it should be storing it. Now at this point, we'll say, well, wait a minute, you added the method, Mehul, why aren't you saving it? Well, of course, we are only saying that there's a method available. We're not actually calling it. So in order to call it, we have to set it somewhere, and we should do that on the onSorting change. So for example, now in the onSorting change, we can call save sorting, and anytime it saves, it will also save it in the browser's SessionStorage. So for example, as you can see here, as soon as I changed, the event was fired, and the browser is now saving our custom item. So that's really nice. But however, if I still refresh, you can see it's not going to load it. So how do we do that? Well, as you can imagine, just like there's a save sorting method, there is a load sorting that allows us to call get item. So set item sets the value, get item lets us read the value. Now, when do we call load sorting? Well, as you can imagine, we should do it when we are first setting the initial state in the constructor. So in our case, we've got a constructor that says, listen, I've got an array where I'm setting the initial value. Well, let's do this. Let's make it empty. And instead, we'll use whatever the user last defined. So we will call load sorting that says, listen, if load sorting has a value, use that empty array, whatever they stored last. However, as you can see, we've got the OR statement here that says, listen, if it's empty, just go with this initial value, which is essentially also an empty value, or it could have been that value where we defined that said its company name or country and ascending or descending. So as we can see now, this is going to allow us to use the browser session storage to keep some light information. For example, now I'm going to sort by, let's say, 4 different columns here. And even if I do a browser refresh or F5, it will reload that value for us. Now, let's go a little bit further and say, now that we've taken over control over this grid and its state, it might be useful for us to have some functionality that says, listen, what if I have a button that allows me to completely reset sorting? Well, let's do that. Let's add a little button. Now, because we've got Bootstrap already installed, let's use the button component from the package React Bootstrap and simply add that above our grid. So I'm going to call this button, and as we can see, we've got this, we've got our grid here, and what we can do is I can simply add the button here. Now, when you first do this, it's going to complain, and that's because you've got multiple components, and if you've got multiple components, make sure you add them to a div. All right, so in this case, let's wrap both these components in a div. And then, as we'll see, we should have a button from it that says reset sorting. And as you see, we've got a Bootstrap button that says reset sorting. Now, before we do this, what we want to do is as I did that, what you can see is I've got a method in it that says onClick. Now, this onClick says, listen, I want you to call this components on sorting change with an empty array. That means clear out, and I shouldn't say clear out, but essentially pass it an empty array. So the sorting state essentially is reset. And so as we can see, it's a button component. And again, this is the beautiful thing about JSX. I just really love this concept of JSX, but it allows us to have something that looks very much like the standard JavaScript events. I mean, obviously we can see there's some differences in there, but in essence, it allows us to call the onSorting change and clear it out. Now, one thing I will warn you is that when you use that create React app, in the app CSS, there is a style that says apt text align center, and I would recommend to remove it because then it won't center everything. So for example, as you saw, the button was getting centered there, but I don't want it to be centered. All right, so now, as we can see, taking control over state allows us to really handle things. Let's say, for example, adding a button to reset the state or when the sorting is done. It just gives us full control. All right, so now let's talk about a slightly different topic, and that is this concept of custom templates. Now, as you can imagine, our grid provides a way for you to really enhance the look and feel of it. This is one of the specialties. This is we've been making grids for many years, and we know what customers really want to do is not just take the base functionality. A lot of times they want to take it further, and therefore we've given you this idea. We've given you this capability to use templates. Now, what are templates? Well, if you've used anything in HTML, you're probably familiar that templates allow you to extend not just the user interface, but functionality of a piece of user interface. Now, our grid is using the table view, and in the table view, we provide you several templates. Now, specifically today, I want to talk about the TableCell template, which allows you to render the table cell, and it takes a couple of arguments. It takes the row and column, so it allows us to inspect the individual cell value and affect how that cell value is rendered. So how do you do that? How do we then extend that functionality? All right, let's take a look at this little bit of code. And in the table cell, in the table view component, subcomponent, we're going to add the table cell template. And in it, what we've got are the column and the row props, as we saw before. And in it, we're saying, listen, I'm going to create a parameter called value that says, give me the current value of name for the column at the current row. So this gives us the cell value. And we're saying, listen, if the cell's value is equal to London, I want you to paint that cell with a different color. And I want you to, previously it was known as bold, but now I want you to essentially wrap it in a strong element, strong HTML element. So now, as you can see, anytime it comes up on London, we're going to set it to a light green value. Now, we can easily do this, for example, with, let's say, UK instead. So now, if it sees, anytime it sees the cell value UK, it will update our grid to display that. Now, you have full control not only over the markup, but also the styles. Now, one thing I'll mention is this, while it's not necessary in this case, sometimes if you have, let's say, several ifs or a case statement or something like that, you may want a path that returns the default template, in which case you can simply call return undefined. Now, in the last webinar, and actually in this webinar too, we're still using Bootstrap. And again, what's nice about this, and I'll simply restate, we decided to not create our own themes and instead use Bootstrap. And as I mentioned before, what's nice is when you're using Bootstrap, you can use just about any theme. So for example, you go to Bootswatch, there's all these nice themes that you can come in and use. Let's say, for example, if I wanted to use Flatly, I can come in here, I can copy this link for this minified CSS and simply use that. So let's say, for example, I like the Slate. Well, I can, for example, let's go back here and go back to Slate. And let's say I wanted to have the grid and all of this React app use Slate. Well, with Bootstrap, what I can do is if I look in my public, I've got an index HTML, and just before the body is finished, I can say, listen, I want you to use this Slate style. And instantly, I'll be using that theme, but also our grid will update. And what's nice is I can easily switch that. So for example, I know there's a Cosmo, and if I switch over to that, I will simply update my entire font and styles and be using that. So that's a beautiful thing. Now, however, I said that we also support the other major theme, which is Bootstrap, and which is Material UI. And so Material UI is a design language from Google. Now, if you've never seen it, it's very slick. It not only has a different a look to it, but it also actually provides a let's go back here. It also provides a set of smaller widgets and so forth. And so let's see, Material UI. So this is a library that is similar to the React Bootstrap library. The community has taken the Material Design language from Google and created a set of React components similar to React Bootstrap. And this allows us to not only use the theme, but also a set of smaller components. Now, they provide things like buttons and so forth. But what's nice is they also provide this really nice design language, and they use this design language in just about everything. So for example, they've got this type of component, and they've got some animations. So when I clicked on it, as you can see, there's a small flyover. When I click on a button, there's some animations, all that good stuff. Now, one thing I want to mention is the way we are supporting Material UI is we are supporting their version 1 that they are working on. And therefore, anytime you're using it, you're actually going to be on the latest beta. Now, as you can imagine, they generally release before we do. So for example, right now they're on beta 6, and right after this webinar, we're going to be publishing some packages that gets us in tune with the latest version. So when you are first installing it, don't use the @next, use just npm install Material UI and Material UI icons to get support for Material UI. And we have examples of this. So I recommend that you follow our guide in doing this, and you can find that right here. So for example, on the very first getting started, as we saw in part 1, of course you bring in the core package and the grid package, and then you decide, do I want the Bootstrap or do I want the Material UI? So in our case, we're going to want the Material UI. So to bring in Material UI, of course, we need to bring in this package. Now, I am going to, as I mentioned, this is what the command you normally want to use. But because I've asked the team, in the wild, beautiful world of JavaScript, things are always changing. And so to make sure that this webinar went off without a hitch, I said, listen, please don't upload any packages until we've got this webinar done. And that's why in this one, I'm using a slightly different beta. But again, once this webinar is over, we're going to publish packages, so you don't need to worry about beta 3 or alpha 19 and so forth. What's more important is you want to make sure, the first and foremost, what we're doing is we're bringing in the Material UI package as well as the UI icons as this library recommends. Bring in the Material UI React components and the Material UI icons React components into our package. So this is simply going to update our package JSON so we can use them. All right. Now, as you know, from the first example of the first webinar, whenever we bring in a package, the way to actually start using it is to call the import statement. Now, of course, we don't need to bring in just those packages. We're going to bring in, of course, the grids, React Grid Material UI version as well. So we need to bring in this npm package as well. So not only in this example will I have the Bootstrap package, but I'll have the Material UI. So what's nice about this is that when I do this, you can see I can easily switch over to the Material UI version of the grids, and it's really that easy. So the reason I am discussing though is because there is a couple of components you may want to bring in order to customize this. Okay, so now that it's done loading, let's change this over from the Bootstrap 3 version, DX React Grid, over to Material UI. Now, as soon as we do this, what's going to happen is we are still using the same grid. We're still setting the same state and components and all that good stuff. But as you saw, now we've switched over. So even though we're using Bootstrap here, we have now switched over to using the Material UI grid. And as you can see, we've got the nice little animations, we've got the nice theme, all that good stuff. However, you'll see that there's some differences. Now, the first is that this right now is using the light theme. Now, if you want to customize this, this is where you want to make sure you use some particular components from the Material UI library, the React Material UI library. So let's do that. We're going to import in a couple of components. Well, one component and a method. So we're going to be calling the Mu Theme Provider component and the Create Mu Theme from the Material UI Styles package. And what this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to specify the theme. Now I'm also going to bring in the create palette method as well. So what this is going to allow us to do is to create a let's just define this right above our grid view component so we can see it a little easier. And here, as we see, I'm calling the create mu theme and the create palette, and now this is going to allow us to set the theme to either light or dark version. Now, let's say at this point you might say, well, that's great, can I do that right away? And as you see, even if you change this value at the moment, even though you're defining it, we actually haven't told this grid that we want it to do that. So what we need to do is we need to wrap our app component that is being rendered in the method, in the mu theme provider. So let's do that. So here, now we want to make sure that we we wrap the entire thing in the mu theme provider, which now allows us control over this this theme. And now, just like that, we can switch over and use the dark theme or the light theme. And as you can see, for example, I can simply specify control over my material UI themes. Okay, that's very easy. As you see, this extensible plugin architecture is really there to make your life easy. And again, this is one of the beautiful things about React that I'm a big fan of. Okay, now let's switch over, and the rest of this, I want to mostly discuss the next two major topics, which is remote data binding and Redux integration. So remote data binding basically says I don't store the data locally. Now, in certain cases, obviously we're going to have state locally. This is a SPA application after all, a single page application. And in those cases, generally we want to have state. So in some cases, we'll say, listen, when I want to store how I sorted the grid, store it in the browser session storage. That's great. You know, browser session storage is meant to be light. You don't want to store a bunch of things. However, information such as a set of customer data or orders and so forth, generally, if it's small enough, like 1,000 rows or something like that, you'll say, okay, well, I'll store it in a local JSON file, as we did with the customer's JSON in this version. However, if you have million records, you're not going to store that locally in a SPA application. You're going to have that in a remote database somewhere. And this is where it makes sense for remote data binding. However, when you remotely data bind, you also change, for example, how the grid works with sorting and paging and so forth. And therefore, when I for example, click on order number here, when I sorted this data, I am not going to sort it locally. I'm not going to go and get a million records and then sort it. It doesn't make sense. In fact, what I want to do is I want to be able to get, for example, page 2's worth of 10 rows here that we're displaying that are sorted by order number. So in order to do that, what I have to do is generate a query that handles that for me, and then submit that query, get the JSON data, and then the grid will do the nice handy job of loading that data for us. So if you take a look at the source code in this demo, you'll find a really nice example. And in this example, as you can see, we've got the grid and all that good stuff. However, and again, you know, in this case, we've taken over state. As you can see, we've got state, we're setting some props, all that good stuff. But one of the key differences here is that in this one, we're hooking into a couple of lifecycle events in here. And of course, did mount, did update calls something called load data. And you might say, well, what's going on, Mehul? Well, as you saw previously, in our grid, when we were rendering the grid, we would essentially have rows bound to the customer's data. Well, in this case, we're telling it, listen, rows is simply going to be a prop that is set, and we set that using state. And but first, we need to go get that. I shouldn't say state. We are setting that using load data. And so what does load data do? So our load data method, and this is what you will need essentially to handle remote data binding. You need something called load data and fetch. And so what load data says, listen, I want you to create a variable called query string and call the query string method. And so this query string is what's going to generate the method. So as you can imagine, this is where we define those. Now, query string essentially says, listen, I've got some objects and parameters that have arrays within them, like sorting, paging, and page size and current page, and they're going to be those are values that I do have in state. So this component has taken over state from that grid component and is going to allow us access to what those values are, because we're going to need them. Because as you can see, query string simply says, listen, I've got a URL, and as we'll see, we've got a URL up here that says, listen, I've got some JSON data that's coming from this data.order items. And it could be a lot of data, it could be a little amount of data, but I only care for you to get a certain amount of data. And therefore, this takes in a couple of parameters, take and skip. Now, if you ever try to write a custom data access for our grid, you'll be familiar with these commands. But take and skip will allow you to set things like page size and what page number to get. And these parameters are essentially used to generate our query string. And once it's generated, we also may need to define, for example, if the data is sorted by any columns and so forth. And then we return this query string. And once this query string is returned, we call the fetch method. And you might say, what is fetch, Mehul? Well, if we take a look, if you Google fetch HTML5, you will see that this is a method that is implemented by many browser objects. And if you are familiar with the good old XHTML TTP request, this is sort of the successor to that. Well, why? Because it essentially uses this concept of promises to work with the request and response object, as well as easily work with cores and HTTP origin headers, all this good stuff. Now, I don't have time to get into this, but essentially, fetch allows you to call the information, call the query string, and then handle the response object from the JSON, and then allow us to parse that and set it to our rows, as well as get the total data count. And that's it. And if there's any errors, we'll catch those as well. So now remote data binding says, listen, when I am sorting by store state and I'm on the third page, generate the query string, call fetch, and then reload the remote data binding. All right, with that said, let's talk quickly about Redux. Redux is a way for you to store information in a central place for React applications, React apps. And why is that important? Well, when Facebook first released React, they also released a pattern that was kind of a best practice, and it was called Flux. And they basically said, if you have several components, for example, here I've got one grid component, or let's say each one of these are trying to keep a state. Let's say they were outside. I had a bunch of buttons or text boxes and so forth. If I've got several components all trying to keep state, this can become a headache. It can almost become a nightmare for debugging. So what they said is, why don't you store that locally? And Redux is the answer. Redux is the implementation of the Flux pattern that says, listen, this is a better way for you to manage state. Now, I don't have, unfortunately, the time to get into Redux completely, so let me explain as best as I can, and then I'll show you how our grid works with it. Now, I believe this is actually a pretty good diagram, and let me see if I can explain it. Now, basically, we've got React components, and components, as we know, use props to pass state and so forth. However, React components can cause actions to be triggered. For example, I click a button to reset storing, right? Well, that caused an action. And actions are an object, and they generally contain a type label or some other information. And they send to the store via a dispatch method. Now, in our case, this store, the way the store then takes the action, and the action has a payload in it, and then it sends it to a reducer. So what's a reducer, and why is it called a reducer? Well, the reducer essentially takes what the action is and its payload and reduces it to a new state. And once we get that, we can then call set state to store this into Redux. And then Redux will then initiate an event. So a reducer, as you can imagine, is just a pure function. It just takes the previous state and the action and then returns a new state based on changes, therefore reducing what has coming into it. And so you can have one reducer, you can have several reducers, but once the store receives this new state, it's got the immutable, it doesn't change the state. I apologize for that. It does not change the state. Instead, it creates a new version of the state, and therefore giving us always a snapshot, a complete snapshot of what has happened in our application and which component affected that as well. But not only once the state changes, a new event, a change event is triggered. Now, any React components that have subscribed to this change event will make a call to get the new state from the store, and then the components are updated in the virtual DOM. Now, this is awesome. This is one of the beautiful things about React, as we know. So once again, we are working in JavaScript, and we simply say, listen, when the button is clicked to reset sorting or saving the state, then call an action, and the action has a payload that says, I'm coming from this component, and this is what's happened, and here's a new value. And then we send it over to a reducer that says, okay, well, based on which action you are and what's in the payload, I'm then going to call and save the state, which will update the state, and then call any changes to update the DOM. Beautiful cycle. This is the unidirectional data flow, as we talked about. It keeps things simple, allows us to debug much easier, and it also gives us access to a timeline. Now, if you take a look at our Redux integration, you see that we have enabled for you to use the Redux Dev Extension tool. Now, I've got it installed here, and if it's enabled, you'll see this little button light up. And so what's nice about this is that let's right click and bring it over to the right side here. Now, anytime I'm going to be changing the state, and let's minimize this so you can see a little easier. Anytime I'm changing the state here, as you can see, it's keeping the diff. And every time I click something on the grid, we're calling something called grid state change action. And that has a payload of what got changed. And if we take a look at the state here, I'm keeping all sorts of props here. And this is what's getting changed and saved. But what's nice about this is that, again, it allows us to do what we call time travel. So because I've also always got a state, a snapshot of my state, I can simply go through. So as you can see, I've got a way to always go back and see what got changed and who made the change. This is an awesome, beautiful thing. So I'll simply tell you that to use this, we've got a very nice example that shows you how to do this. Now, to use the React Grid, to use Redux, let me do a quick sample here. And I've Redux sample. And again, this is similar to the version that you saw here. And let's just blot it up. Actually, let's pop it up here. Now, in this example, as you can imagine, what you'll need is an action. And in our case, I'm creating one action that says, listen, it's called the grid state change action. Anytime something changes, it's going to have a field name and a value. And therefore, we can then define a reducer. And the reducer says, listen, I've got a couple of things. I've got state, and we can define what that is by setting the initial grid state. And this is similar to what we did in the constructor before. But what we're essentially doing is we're changing our grid from the EX6 class over to a stateless component. And you will say, wait a minute, Mehul, you went from a stateless component to an ES6 class, so it could be stateful, and now you're going back? Well, yes, because we are now letting Redux manage the state. So now what we're doing is I simply called it my grid, and I said I've got some props, and those props have an initial state value, and the way it gets changed is through a reducer. And a reducer, as we said, is a pure function that says, listen, if the action type is a grid state change, then I care. And once again, this is where the magic happens, because I create a value, a variable called next state, and that says, listen, copy whatever the previous state tree is, but replace a couple of values in there from the payload of the action called field name and value, and return next state. Otherwise, if it's not that action, just return whatever the state is. And what's beautiful about this is that just the way React manages the virtual DOM for us, now Redux is going to help us manage state, not just for our grid, but for several components. And if you all follow and have multiple reducers and multiple actions based on what the components are, Redux does it beautifully. And again, to create it, all we're going to call is the create store from Redux, and then pass it our grid reducer. And if you also pass in this parameter, when this Redux Dev Tools action, this will do that nice little light up that allows you to do that. But now this grid says completely, listen, I'm going to give it over to Redux. Now, a couple of things I should mention is that, yes, not only do you bring in the Redux store, the Redux package, but there's also a second package that says React Redux that allows you to map, for example, the state to props as well as the dispatch to props. And so this couple of methods are necessary, and in the final thing we're going to do is that we're no longer going to reference that grid directly. Instead, we're going to say I've got something called Redux Grid that connects over to takes our web component, maps the props and the dispatch, and then gives us back this Redux Grid. And then we wrap the whole thing in the provider and send it to a store. Now, again, I apologize if that's a lot to give you at once. Redux is a really excellent topic to dive into, and I highly recommend you use it. There's a lot of great examples out there on the web. And if you're interested, the Redux documentation really has a great getting started. They have a bunch of free videos about it. And again, once you get the concept of actions, reducers, and the data flow, you'll find it's actually not that difficult. And at the end of the day, let me simply wrap up by saying that this can all seem a bit overwhelming. This can all seem like, wow, I'm basically programming the DOM again. That's the beauty of React. That is where you have full control. This is where you can say, I'm affecting exactly what I want, and React keeps things light and fast. And if you don't believe me, definitely check out our demos where you can see, for example, our virtual scrolling demo. And you can just see, for example, I've got 200,000 records here, and as I'm scrolling, look how fast that is. It's awesome. So React has some great advantages. Our grid in React is excellent. And I'll simply say one last thing before I hand it back to Amanda, and that is I'll talk a little bit real quick about our roadmap. And our roadmap essentially is you. We have some ideas, and in these days at DevExpress, we want to hear from you more than ever, especially with client-side technologies like JavaScript. Things are always changing. New ideas are coming up, new ways of doing things, and so we want to know what's important to you. We want to know your scenarios, particularly. Are you using templates in a certain way? Do you need a particular component? What's next that you would really like for us to do? And again, we have some ideas, but before I say, listen, this is definitely something in our plans, tell us. Those of you on this webinar right now, I thank you. You guys are I wouldn't even call this the bleeding edge. React has been around a couple years now. However, I can absolutely understand if you're deep into some other technology, to jump over to convert to React. Yes, it can be a big change, but it's definitely something worth looking at. All right, with that said, Amanda, let me hand it back to you and see if there's any questions we can help answer.
Hey, Mehul. So we do have one question that popped up. Is it possible to mix the modes? Like you could use Redux for dealing with some methods and have the rest of the grid in uncontrolled mode, i.e. sorting, paging, handled locally.
Yes, there might be some issues. I believe so, but again, if you go to the how do I put it? I won't say trouble, but if you're gonna go that far and add Redux, for example, to add, as you can see in Redux, you do this simple npm install, and then as you saw, you got to bring in a couple of other things. The dev tools is really nice, but as you saw, you're gonna create the store, you're gonna define the action, etc., etc. If you're gonna go that far, why not let Redux handle the entire thing? The idea with Redux is it's a central store. So why mix the two? If you're going to go with the concept of a central store, just say, okay, well, that's the whole reason I added Redux, because I want to centralize my state management. In that case, you can have that nice thing where you time travel, but not just time travel. As you saw from the dev tools, we knew exactly what action caused what state change for the DOM to get updated. So if something misbehaved, I can go, oh, okay, this is what caused that issue. Makes debugging easier, just makes life easier. But that's my 2 cents.
All right, Mehul, that looks like all of the questions.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Amanda.
Great. Thanks, Mehul. All right, everybody. Like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be made available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I posted the link in the chat box. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Mehul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.